in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And there is very grave danger. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. But I am asking your help of informing and alerting the American people.
And I look at the whole religious scene today, and all I see are the inventions and ministries of man and flesh. It's mostly powerless. It has no impact on the world. And I see more of the world coming into the church and impacting the church rather than the church impacting the world. I see the music taking over the house of God. I see entertainment taking over the house of God. An obsession with entertainment in God's house, a hatred of correction and a hatred of reproof. Nobody wants to hear it anymore. Whatever happened to anguish in the house of God? Whatever happened to anguish in the ministry? It's a word you don't hear in this pampered age. You don't hear it. Anguish means extreme pain and distress. The emotion so stirred that it becomes painful. Acute, deeply felt inner pain because of conditions about you, in you or around you. Anguish, deep pain, deep sorrow, agony of God's heart. We've held on to our religious rhetoric and our revival talk, but we've become so passive. All true passion is born out of anguish. All true passion for Christ comes out of a baptism of anguish. You search the scripture and you'll find that when God determined to recover a ruined situation, he would share his own anguish for what God saw happening to his church and to his people. And he would find a praying man and he would take that man and literally baptize him in anguish. You find it in the book of Nehemiah. Jerusalem is in ruins. How is God going to deal with this? How is God going to restore the ruin? Now, folks, look at me. Nehemiah was not a preacher. He was a career man. This was a praying man. And God found a man who would not just have a flash of emotion, not just some great sudden burst of concern and then let it die. He said, no, I broke down and I wept and I mourned and I fasted. And then I began to pray night and day. Why didn't these other men, why didn't they have an answer? Why didn't God use them in restoration? Why didn't they have a word? Because there was no sign of anguish, no weeping, not a word of prayer. It's all ruined. Does it matter to you today? Does it matter to you at all that God's spiritual Jerusalem, the church, is now married to the world? That there's such a coldness sweeping the land? Closer than that, does it matter about the Jerusalem that's in our own hearts? The sign of ruin that's slowly draining spiritual power and passion, blind to lukewarmness, blind to the mixture that's creeping in. That's all the devil wants to do, is get the fight out of you and kill it. So you won't labor in prayer anymore. You won't weep before God anymore. You can sit and watch television and your family go to hell. Let me ask you, is what I just said convicted you at all? There's a great difference between anguish and concern. Concern is something that begins to interest you. You take an interest in a project or a cause or a concern or a need. I'm going to tell you something I've learned over all my years, 50 years of preaching. If it is not born in anguish, if it has not been born by the Holy Spirit, where when you saw and heard of the ruin, that drove you to your knees. And all our projects, all our ministries, everything we do, where are the Sunday school teachers that weep over kids they know are not hearing and they're going to hell? You see, a true prayer life begins at the place of anguish, a place where lifetime decisions are made. You see, if you set your heart to pray, God's going to come and start sharing his heart with you. You see, you either walk away and go back to your passivity and say, I'm just going to be an ordinary Christian, and there's no such thing. Or your heart begins to cry out, oh God, your name is being blasphemed. The Holy Spirit's being mocked. The enemy is out trying to destroy the testimony of the Lord's faithfulness, and something has to be done. You can't go unchallenged. There's going to be no renewal, no revival, no awakening until we're willing to let him once again break us. Folks, it's getting late and it's getting serious. Please don't tell me you're concerned. Don't tell me that you want your unsaved loved one saved when you're spending hours in front of internet or television. Come on. Lord, there's some need to get this altar and confess, I am not what I was. I am not where I'm supposed to be. God, I don't have your heart or your burden. I wanted it easy. Just want to be happy. But Lord, true joy comes. True joy comes out of anguish. There's nothing of the flesh will give you joy. I don't care how much money, I don't care what kind of new house, there is absolutely nothing physical could give you joy. It's only what is accomplished by the Holy Spirit when you obey him and take on his heart. Build the walls around your family. Build the walls around your own heart. Make you strong and impregnable against the enemy.
We are wondering what is happening to the world. Everything is changing.
The very idea of human being some sort of natural concept is really going to change.
Our bodies will be so high-tech, we won't be able to really distinguish between what's natural and what's artificial.
Inside our own heads is the most complex arrangement of matter in the known universe.
You might ask yourself, can we get to be superhumans?
The original Industrial Revolution was driven by the discovery that you could use steam engines to do all kinds of interesting things.
But that was followed by additional revolutions for electricity and computers and communications technology. We're now in the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, which is bringing together digital, physical, and biological systems.
One of the features of this fourth industrial revolution is that it doesn't change what we are doing, but it changes us.
With the ability to visualize brain activity, for example, through a simple consumer-based EEG device, it gives us access to ourselves in ways that we've never before thought possible. It unlocks the black box that is the brain and enables us to really, truly be able to realize an identity that is aspirational.
There's now a scientific foundation for the effects of mindfulness on the brain, on the genome, on biological aging. And when the human mind does know itself, then you get the potential for a new renaissance that restructures itself in terms of our relationship to life, our relationship to the planet, our relationship to work.
We need a different economic model. And by that I don't mean capitalism versus communism. What I'm talking about is a shift in the system along the lines of the two big changes that happened in the 20th century, Keynesianism, with a much greater focus on health and education and the role of government working with business, and then a reaction against that in late century to neoliberalism, where the focus was on free markets, freedom of the individual, and getting governments out of the way. We need a shift to a new system that will allow us to meet the basic needs of every human on the planet, that will live within planetary means, that will be fairer, and that will be focused as its key goal, not on growth per se, but on maximizing human well-being. And history tells us that a values shift is triggered by creation of a new story about how we want to live.
I see the circular economy as something which fits very closely with mankind's goal to be innovative and creative and to always progress. We can use asset tracking, we can use IT, we can use 3D printing to enable this different economic model to recover materials, feed them back into the economy, and really to decouple growth from the resource constraints we have.
The reason we live in cities is not different today than it was 10,000 years ago. Even if we have got networks connecting us, we still want to have places where we meet in person. Well, this means the place where we work and the place where we live are much closer to each other, a city where we don't need to have big supply chains in order to produce things, where many things can be sourced locally thanks to 3D printing and robotics. So if we're able to do something to transform cities, to make them more efficient, then the impact can be huge.
Think about the prospect of getting rid of plastics. We must not only be inspired or informed by nature, but actually use natural organisms with which to design products and building parts. Only instead of varying material properties, we're varying biological functionality.
Design is critical today because it's the first signal of human intention. So the question of adding quality to quantity, it isn't a matter of simply circulating things that are potentially toxic. It's circulating things that are safe and healthy for all generations. So the goal is no longer, I want to be less bad, less monotonous, less unsafe, less unjust. It's really about a diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean energy.
Together we are fighting to preserve our fragile climate from irreversible damage and devastation of unthinkable proportions.
If we think about the original Industrial Revolution, it was an energy revolution. I like to think of it as a kind of bookending of a period in human history during which we used fossil fuels, and it worked very well for us for a long time. But now we have to bring that to an end. We have energy technologies that can power our civilization: solar, wind, biomass. So then the question is, well, how do we get grid integration? Maybe the wind is blowing in Denmark, the sun is shining in Germany, and now you can move that electricity through an integrated grid. You can supply energy to everyone who needs it, and you can supply energy at all times.
Walking around, you do see different stuff as far as like the body marriage line. They use a lot of things that help them lift up and move things to the car. You just sit there and, you know, program something, and it has its own set mind to go ahead and do everything. And then as humans, we just come in and take the extra step to help the technology.
It's not the cure-all for everything. There's definitely a lot of things where people perform the operation better, but certainly for the right applications, robotics are a huge improvement for the process.
The prediction of 5 million jobs lost by 2020 to technology is serious, but it's not the main question. Construction, manufacturing, services, public health and education, these industries will still exist. The main question is, what will be the future of work? How will we define work? How will we share the wealth?
From the viewpoint of the labor or jobs, now we really need new education or new training.
We're working with a World in Motion in FIRST Robotics, trying to encourage students from 3rd grade all the way up through the end of high school. We had students make sailboats, and then we had them race them, and so they could see how quickly they could move. And they immediately went back and started to say, oh, I saw what happened, I'm going to go change this or that. And that was 3rd graders.
I just given a prize to a kid of 18 years old that has discovered something really very, very unique. Came up with how to get better productivity and better yields for seeds of corn. And so he basically came with the idea that if you would perforate these seeds, you would get more food. And you think about it and say, but he didn't go to university. So how does he get all that knowledge? And he told me, I mean, I've been watching YouTube since the age of 12, and I'm so interested that I've seen everything about it. I've read everything about it. The world is really open to learning. The thing is, how do you give the incentive to your kids to do that?
It's this ability of digital technology to change outcomes, to truly empower people all over the world that can create a more equitable growth, because I think the world needs that.
Fourth industrial revolution has the potential to make inequalities visible and to make them less acceptable in the future, and hopefully to gather and garner political support to take the necessary decision to reduce the gap.
Humans have always been using tools, but because of the recent advances in technology, we're beginning to have machines that can augment us in all sorts of interesting ways.
I was the first person in the world to be able to voluntarily move my legs while stepping in a robot by exciting the nervous system using electrical stimulators directly onto the spine. We believe that a cure will be possible if enough of the right people have the will to fast-track a cure for paralysis.
We take two things from the patient. First, we take a three-dimensional X-ray, and we extract the three-dimensional data out of that so we can make a perfectly shaped puzzle piece. And then we also take a sample of fat tissue from the patient so that we can extract the stem cells out of those. And we use those stem cells with this three-dimensional scaffold that we fabricate, and after 3 weeks, we have a piece of living bone that's ready for implantation.
Being able to use genome editing to understand the genetic changes that lead to cancer, and technologies like drug delivery, getting molecules into particular types of cells. There's a lot of excitement about being able to move much more quickly on this disease.
One of the things that I think is so essential to free and open societies is freedom of thought. And up until now, the conversation we've been having is around freedom of speech. Once we can access people's thoughts and access people's emotions, we have to create a space that enables people to think freely, to think divergent thoughts, to think creative thoughts. And in a society where people fear having those thoughts, the likelihood of being able to enjoy progress is significantly diminished.
We need to take responsibility at every level of society, from the individual and the personal to the institutional to the global, to adapt to these technological challenges and changes which are redefining what it means to be human, what it means to work, what it means to be completely embedded in this world.
People always ask me if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. The technology exists, but how do we get it and implement it at the scale we need at a price that people around the world can afford?
Even though we have everyday problems we have to solve, we have to find a way to lay the foundations for the innovations of tomorrow.
Just a year ago, we passed 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the pre-industrial level was about 280 parts per million. So human society in the industrial era has raised the level of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 40%, and many people fear that before we're done, we're going to double it or even triple it.
We're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at a speed which we have never seen before in modern human history. We are absolutely racing into uncharted territory.
In our lifetime, human beings left behind the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincides with the rise of human civilization. We have crossed a great threshold. And we stand on the edge of others.
I remember when the Weather Channel was this kind of like nice, sleepy little station. Now it's like a horror show. The climate is being disrupted. That's not for next year or 1,000 years from now. That's happening right now.
What all climate scientists will agree on is that the entire atmosphere has changed. All the atmospheric dynamics have changed. So every event that happens now is in the context of climate change. It's different from how it would have been.
Typhoon slammed the Philippines with winds of 195 miles per hour. That's higher than the winds from Hurricane Sandy and Katrina combined.
The world is mobilizing to help the Philippines, but just a trickle of food and water and medicine has reached the victims of Typhoon Haiyan.
More than 1 million people were forced to flee their homes, many now trying to salvage what's left.
Hundreds of thousands are thronging relief centers, desperate for life's necessities.
Many residents covered their faces to mask the smell of the dead while they searched for relatives in some of the hardest hit areas.
This is one of the top storms ever seen on this planet.
Mr. President, Your Excellency, what my country is going through as a result of this extreme climate event is madness. Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in my own family's hometown. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. To anyone outside who continues to deny and ignore the reality that is climate change, I dare them to get off their ivory towers and away from the comfort of their armchairs. I dare them to go to the islands of the Pacific. We refuse as a nation to accept a future where super typhoons like Haiyan become a way of life. We refuse to accept that running away from storms, evacuating our families, counting our dead become a way of life. We simply refuse to. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
Hello, hello, hello. All right, folks, we know why we're here. We have 80 days starting tomorrow to pull off the largest climate march in history. It's really important for folks to remember that although climate change affects everyone, the impacts are not evenly distributed. And we're asking each one of these breakout groups, prioritize people of color, folks, because this is real, it's disproportionate, and it's time to bring it.
They need to act on a binding global agreement to reduce greenhouse gases. We can do that and create jobs at the same time.
Part of what we're doing is moving people from fossil fuels to the solutions and also presenting them with economic opportunities around the solution.
The idea of who's going to be leading this march are the people in this room.
This environmental issue is the singular issue of our time, of our day, that will determine how we live, where we live, and if we live.
The most important tool that we have is our people power. There are already 325 groups, and that list is going to grow every single day. Whatever you're thinking about doing to help build this mobilization, rethink it and make it bigger, make it bolder. Our job is to make sure everybody hears about it, and then they'll get there. They'll get there. That's our job.
In 1982, the UN convened
a first special session on nuclear disarmament. And we came together and said, when the representatives of governments all around the world gather in New York City at the UN, we need to be on the streets making our voice heard.
New York City's anti-nuclear demonstration turned out to be the biggest political demonstration in U.S. history.
It was, and still to this date, is the largest single gathering, if you will, of people in this country. I think there was one computer in the office. Everything else was by phone and this thing we called the mail. We now call it a snail mail, whatever. But there was something about that reality that we didn't have, the technology that we now have, that actually forced people to talk directly to each other.
We have real peace with real justice. We will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
One of the really interesting things about that demonstration is that some 600 local groups were formed, and many of those groups lasted for years afterwards. To me, the real power of that day was the organizing experience that led up to it, and then the organizing that came out of it.
Some experts are saying now that the whole world is heating up because of a global greenhouse effect.
Scientists had been saying for a long time that climate change might occur, but 1988 is the year when Jim Hansen and his team at NASA say, both in the scientific peer-reviewed literature and in public, that it's actually happening.
The changes in atmospheric composition that humans were making was going to have a big impact on the Earth's climate.
The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
Hansen's testimony was reported on the front page of the New York Times, and there was actually a bill introduced into Congress, the National Energy Policy Act, to immediately begin to phase out the use of fossil fuels in order to prevent disruptive climate change. And of course, that was supported by the creation of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that year. So there was political momentum, there was scientific momentum, there was strong scientific evidence, there was media attention, and then the whole thing kind of fell apart.
The Earth Summit, a 12-day, 178-nation conference on the environment, began today in Rio de Janeiro. Battle lines are already drawn between the haves and the have-nots.
So far, all the agreements are non-binding, requiring no specific action on the environment.
As time has gone on, the scientific warnings keep intensifying, and yet there has been no effective political response. All political efforts to get a handle on this issue have essentially failed.
I am the one that is burdened with finding the balance between sound environmental practice on the one hand and jobs for American families on the other.
The agreement hammered out in Kyoto, Japan, requires industrialized nations to make substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions.
The United States actually never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which is one reason it didn't work.
President Bush ignited a storm of controversy when he decided to abandon the Kyoto Protocol, which sets caps on the emissions of greenhouse gases in developed nations.
For nearly 2 weeks, the U.S. delegation had blocked proposal after proposal, draft after draft, refusing to even discuss mandatory cuts in greenhouse emissions.
Now we switch to the big climate conference going on in Copenhagen.
Today, developing countries made themselves heard.
People are dying.
Led by Africa, 135 nations, including India and China, staged a 5-hour boycott, angry over what they say are insufficient carbon cuts proposed by the world's rich countries.
If Hollywood had been writing the story, you know, it all would have come right in the end, and all the nations would have pledged their best effort. And nothing like that happened. The thing was a fiasco, a failure.
The frustrations of the last 10 days explode on the streets of Copenhagen. Outside the Bella Center, where negotiators still haven't reached a climate agreement, 2,500 protesters try to storm the hall to make an impact.
Nothing happened because the fossil fuel industry was still strong enough to scare nations into avoiding the issue.
What happened in Copenhagen for a lot of people was this realization no leader was coming to save us.
We have to be strong enough to scare our national leaders into doing the right thing in New York City in September. If we can demonstrate that, then better things will happen in Paris than happened in Copenhagen.
These things are not separate moments in time. This is all part of one string, and what we're fighting towards in Paris is highly dependent on what happens in September. This is going to have to be the fight of our lives.
Welcome to this press conference to present the report of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change.
If we really want to bring about a limitation of temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, there is then the need for an unprecedented level of international cooperation.
The way we've approached climate change is the scientific community builds the case, it synthesizes the evidence, it presents that.
What great pleasure to welcome the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, here among us in Davos, just some days after you have been taken officially possession of your mandate and your office. I think never a UN Secretary General has been so well prepared for his so important job, managing global affairs. By formation and in your earlier life, you were a professor for history, so you have all the historical conception and understanding of the world. You served your country as a prime minister, so you have all the managerial experience and leadership experience. You were a neighbor of ours in some way in Geneva when you were for many years, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and taking our motto of this annual meeting, responsive and responsible. You know what responsive means and what fast response means. So without further ado, Mr. Secretary General, we are delighted to have you, I shouldn't say here, to have you back here, because you have been many times here in your earlier incarnations. So please welcome the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Schwab. It's good to be back in Davos. Even if I would start by saying that we live in a dangerous world. We see a proliferation of new conflicts. Old conflicts seem never to die. Conflicts are becoming more and more interlinked, more linked with the new threat of global terrorism. In many situations, they are internal conflicts, asymmetric, with terrible violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. They are the result of fragilities of states, of institutions, of societies. And in a world where power relations became unclear, not only unpredictability and impunity tend to proliferate, but it's very difficult for the international community to prevent crises and to timely solve them. At the same time, if one looks at the interconnection of the global megatrends, population growth and movements of people, climate change, food insecurity, water scarcity, we see how they are more and more intercombined, enhancing each other, and creating situations in which more people is displaced or tension, conflict can emerge. And even if one looks at the amazing results of globalization, technological progress, huge increase in world richness, the fact that trade has multiplied enormously in the last decades, if one sees how living conditions have improved and even how absolute poverty has dramatically decreased, the truth is that inequalities have also terribly increased, and that has created especially because of the globalization of communication, that everybody now is aware of what's happening everywhere, that has created a huge frustration in many sectors of population, frustration that leads to the divorce between public opinion, societies, and not only political establishments, but also international organizations, even like the UN. Now, in this context, it is clear that we need a surge in diplomacy for peace, and I think it is one of the key functions of a Secretary General is to get personally involved in trying to create the conditions for some of these conflicts at least find a way to be resolved. And I think there is only one way to do it. It is to convince the parties to the conflict and the countries that have an influence on the parties to the conflict that today's wars are wars that nobody wins, everybody is losing, and that wars are becoming not only a terrible source of suffering for the populations of the countries involved, but a threat to regional stability. And today, if you look at Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, they also are responsible for this dramatic increase in global terrorism. And so I think that with the threat that is so clear, countries involved should understand that they need to come together and put an end to this conflict. And the pressure over them is, I think, one of the functions that the Secretary General of the United Nations needs to be able, together with many other actors, and also respecting the leadership of member states, the Secretary General should be able to push more strongly in order to be able to at least minimize some of the terrible consequences we are now facing. But it is clear for me that the priority for an organization like the UN, and I would say the priority for the international community, must be prevention. Prevention of conflicts, but not only conflicts, prevention of natural disasters and a certain number of other forms and other threats that undermine the well-being of the population of our planet. And prevention cannot be, especially when we speak about prevention of conflict, cannot be reduced to some form of diplomatic action. Now, prevention needs to be a comprehensive approach. And for an organization like the UN, prevention needs to bring together its three pillars of action: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And needs to recognize that the best prevention for conflict and the best prevention for other negative impacts on societies is, of course, sustainable and inclusive development. And in that regard, we need to take profit of the ambitious agreements of last year, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the agreement on the Agenda to 2030 for Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to mobilize not only governments, not only civil societies, the academia, but the business sector in order to take profit of these agreements and to be together in a new form of partnership aimed at transforming those agreements into areas of action that help to prevent the conflicts and other dramas that we face in today's world. And that means that we need to invest in the resilience of societies. We need to invest in the strength of states, institutions, and civil societies. We need to invest in the protection of human rights. We need to invest in the empowerment of women, but also in addressing this scourge of the youth unemployment that is probably the worst problem we are facing in today's world, with consequences not only for the well-being of the people involved and the societies, but also for global security, as young unemployed people in several parts of the world are the largest area of recruitment for terrorist groups. But also to invest in addressing the basic needs of a population, from education, from health, water, sanitation, and to bring humanitarian and development actors together, namely in the fragile situations that we face in many parts of the world. And at the same time, recognizing that all societies are now multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, to invest in the social cohesion of those societies, for diversity to be a richness, not a threat, for people to be able, first of all, to see their identities valued, but also for people to feel that they belong to the larger community, for societies being inclusive and cohesive, not to become a source of confrontation, not to become a source of instability, as unfortunately in many parts of the world, including in the developed world. Now, in a context like this, and to be able to address these challenges, I think it's very important for the UN to recognize the need to reform. And I would select three main areas of reform. First of all, reform of our peace strategy and architecture. Today, essentially, the UN is known because of the peacekeeping missions, and peacekeeping consumes about 70-something% of our budget. And most of our operations take place in countries where there is no peace to keep. Peacekeepers become inevitably parties of the conflict. And in a number of situations that creates an extremely difficult environment and facilitates the kind of abuses that also tarnish the image of the UN. And we need to make sure that prevention and sustaining peace in countries that finally emerge from conflict must be the priority of the priorities, and hopefully limit our peacekeeping effort in the future much more, thanks to our capacity to prevent crises and to allow for stability to be preserved in societies. The reform of the peace and security areas of the UN. The reform of the UN development system, based on coordination and accountability, to be able to fully support countries in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and in the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And finally, our management reform. The staff rules, the financial rules, the budgetary rules of the UN, if they were the result of a conspiracy not to allow the UN to work, would probably be the same that we have. Obviously, there was no conspiracy. What has happened is that, in the logic of a bureaucracy, central control has tended to not to allow the normal development of adequate procedures, decentralizing, simplifying things, and the difficult relationship between the so-called Western countries and the G77 in the General Assembly, in the so-called Fifth Committee, with the mistrust that exists, has created a tendency for micromanagement that, for instance, doesn't allow me to create a post at a low professional level in any part of the world without going to the General Assembly. Now, we need to engage with all member states to make them understand that there is a win-win strategy if it is based on simplification, decentralization, more flexibility, and in a culture of transparency and accountability. Only a reformed UN can be the engine of one international community able to transform prevention into a true priority, and we know that that would not be easy because cameras are not there when a conflict is prevented. Cameras are only there when a conflict finally takes place. And the second aspect that I believe is absolutely crucial is the enhancement of a new generation of partnerships. Partnerships not only with governments, not only with civil societies, with the academia, but particularly partnerships with the business community in the context of this perspective of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreements on climate change, creating the conditions for an inclusive and sustainable development, the best way to prevent crises and conflicts in today's world. I think it's important to notice, if one looks at the debates that have took place here in the World Economic Forum, that today there is a perfect conscience that the business of businesses is not only business. And we have seen how social corporate responsibility has developed. We have seen how philanthropy has expanded tremendously in the last few years. But what I am particularly interested in the alignment of the core business of the private sector with the strategic goals of the international community. I think that we have gone already very far when one looks at the green economy and when one looks at the efforts to tame climate change. It is clear now that it is good business to invest in the green economy, and that the green economy has created a large number of opportunities for profitable investment for the private sector. And I would say when one looks at the threats that exist today in relation to climate change and the possibility of less supportive action by some governments, I would say that the best allies of all those that want to make sure that the Paris Agreements are implemented, the best allies today in the world are probably in the business sector, and it's very important to fully mobilize them. But even in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, a calculation that was recently made shows that the returns on investment that can be generated by the full implementation of those goals would mean something of the order of magnitude of $30 billion per year, which means that we have here an opportunity both to generate investments that are attractive for the private sector, but simultaneously to allow for the private sector to play an absolutely essential role in making sure that those goals are effectively achieved. Because without the private sector, we will not have the necessary innovation. We will not have the necessary capacity to discover new markets, new products, new services, and to be able to develop new areas in the economy. Without the private sector, we will not create enough jobs and will not bring enough dynamism and stability to the societies that need to be enhanced with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is why I believe that there is now an opportunity for a new platform of partnership at a higher level. And a platform of partnership that can only serve not only in relation to implementing the goals defined in the past, but addressing the challenges that we'll be facing in relation to the future. And namely, the impacts that have been discussed so many times in this World Economic Forum of the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the challenges that the international community face with areas like genetic engineering or artificial intelligence, the problems of the cyberspace, in which it is my deep belief that only with a very strong dialogue and partnership between governments, international organizations, and the private sector, it will be possible to transform them in instruments that will allow for fantastic increase in the well-being of people and avoid the risks that they will be a nightmare for mankind, as unfortunately a totally unregulated form of research in some of these areas could eventually generate. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, thank you for this very encouraging readiness to engage the business community. I can tell you, based on our experience in the preparation of course, of the SDGs, of the Paris Climate Agreement, but I should add also the Addis Ababa agenda. Business was very keen. Now, one question which I have, you talked about the reform of the UN system. It will be very important, like in a company, that you have also the discussion partners who understand the language of business in the organization. And sometimes there's a complaint of the UN being a big mammoth with very administrative minds. You just showed that at least at the top, the contrary is the case. But how do you change this mindset?
Well, we change it doing things. I mean, cultural changes are never possible without movement. It's the movement that generates cultural changes. If you are waiting for a cultural change to then start the movement, we will never get there. My belief is that when one looks at what the international community asks the UN to do, and when one looks at our capacity to deliver, independently of the fact that we should be very proud of what the UN has done, I think we would have much more conflicts without the UN in the last decades. It is clear that humanitarian action of the UN is something of real importance for the well-being of so many people. Many lives were rescued. It is clear that even in the development side, the UN has played a very important role, but let's be honest, we have a lot of shortcomings and we have a lot of inefficiencies that need to be addressed. Now, the experience I have in UNHCR is that it is perfectly possible to move when we feel the pressure. And we now feel the pressure because the needs that are presented by the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals and the dramatic needs coming from the conflict situations in the world will force us to deliver much better. For instance, in an organization like UNHCR, where I've been for 10 years, we were able to reduce our headquarters costs from 14% to 6% and our staff costs from 41% to 21%. I don't know if there are many private companies that have similar results. That means that we need to be able also to convince member states that this is the moment to adopt a win-win strategy in which, instead of micromanaging the organization, they accept that a more flexible and nimble organization will be more able to serve them, especially in our action in the field.
Secretary General, the UN was created 49 last century on the basis of shared values expressed in the Declaration of Human Rights Then you had, again, Fukuyama writing his book. And today we are in a different, it's the end of history, saying we have only one shared value system now in the world, practically the Western value system. Now we are in a different world. We are moving towards a multi-polar system, but also a multi-conceptual system. People have different, countries have different concepts how national and international matters should be managed. How do you keep the UN together if you do not have a shared value system anymore?
I think that we have some shared values, and some of the principles of the Charter remain valuable today. But it's true that we had not the end of history. I think history came back and with a revenge. To a certain extent, history was frozen with the Cold War, and now the ice has melted and history is coming back everywhere. And contradictions, some of them are contradictions of the past, are re-emerging and creating many of the conflicts that we witness in today's world. But it's true that, contrary to the 90s, in which we had a unipolar world and a very clear set of values that were prevailing more or less, the idea that we would move irreversible into open societies, into market economies without restrictions, free trade everywhere, it is clear today that there are different concepts, as you mentioned, and in a world that is moving from unipolar to multipolar, I don't think we have already reached the multipolar world, but we are moving in that direction. I think it is absolutely essential for leaders, especially leaders of those that have more influence in today's state of affairs, to be able to understand there's no way one can impose one's model to the others. I think it's essential to listen. It's essential to understand what are the values of the other, to see how we can combine them in a positive way, and to see what kind of new synthesis is possible, but always being very careful to make sure that a number of fundamental principles are not put into question. And there, the biggest difficulty, I would say, is to make sure, for instance, that the agenda of human rights is not put into question by agendas of national sovereignty or of other sorts.
I liked very much the expression which was used during the luncheon we had of a cooperative world. How would you define it, a cooperative world?
Well, ideally, we would have, in this progressively multipolar world, we would have a multilateral governance system. I mentioned also at lunchtime, sometimes people have the idea that if the world is multipolar, equilibrium and harmony will be automatically generated. Nothing is more false. In Europe, we had a multipolar world in the beginning of the 20th century without any form of multilateral management, multilateral governance, and the result was the First World War. So multipolarity without governance, without multilateral governance, can be a risk instead of being a positive development. Now, the problem is that we don't have enough strengths in our multilateral governance mechanisms. They are all relatively weak, including the United Nations. So the only way to create the equilibrium that is necessary and to avoid the confrontations that would be fatal is through the capacity of those that lead the key actors in this multipolar world to work with each other, to understand each other, and to create conditions in which they all win because they all benefit from them. I'll give you an example that is now very much in the limelight, the question of globalization and free trade. I think that the problem is not to have less globalization, the problem is to have a better globalization. I think it's clear that free trade is something that is a positive asset for us all, but of course free trade has consequences in the cohesion of societies, and we need to address those problems through social policies, through adequate forms of cooperation with the civil society or between governments and the private sector. We need to make sure that we keep the positive aspects of the world order that progressively has been built, and at the same time address its shortcomings, instead of regression to forms of collective life in the world that clearly would mean a drastic reduction in our capacity to bring prosperity to all.
Secretary General, one issue, we see the humanitarian principles increasingly tested or even violated by countries creating obstacles for migrants and particularly for refugees. How do you feel about it, and what actions can you or must be undertaken to counter this trend?
Well, first of all, I think refugee protection is something that is enshrined in international law. Yeah. And when people flee a conflict or persecution, I think it's the obligation of states to grant them protection. And I'm worried with the fact, I have to say that during the 10 years in which I was as High Commissioner for Refugees, basically borders were in general open. There were very limited situations of the so-called refoulement, which means when people are sent back to where they might face persecution. And there was, I would say, a clear integrity in the world protection regime. Last year, we have seen all these things shaking. We see more and more borders closed. We see more and more people not being able even to escape. It's the case of many Syrians that cannot flee the country at the present moment. And we see that the international protection regime is in a crisis. There is now a decision by the General Assembly to have a global compact on migration and a global compact on refugee protection, and I hope that the integrity of the refugee protection regime will be reestablished, and I hope that there will be effective solidarity, especially with those countries of first asylum that are in the front line, not only in relation to the protection of refugees, but in relation to the protection of our global security, and need much more international solidarity than the one they have had. The Jordans, the Lebanons, the Kenyas of this world. But at the same time, I think one needs to have a fresh look on migration. I believe migration is there to stay. I believe migration is part of the solutions of our problems. But if migration is necessary, at least it should be managed. And instead of leaving migration to the control of smugglers and traffickers, I think there should be a much stronger international cooperation on migration, and that development cooperation policies should be defined in a way to avoid those forms of forced displacement. I recognize, for instance, the fact that Spain was very successful when defining forms of development cooperation with Western Africa. They managed to reduce quite substantially the movements to the Canary Islands. Unfortunately, most of our development cooperation policies ignore the questions of human mobility. It would be essential that those policies would address the problems of human mobility, making migration something that happens out of will, not out of necessity, and reducing this pressure on migration flows that, because they are not managed, because they are left to a large extent in the hands of smugglers and traffickers.
And I see more of the world coming into the church and impacting the church rather than the church impacting the world. I see the music taking over the house of God. I see entertainment taking over the house of God. An obsession with entertainment in God's house, a hatred of correction and a hatred of reproof. Nobody wants to hear it anymore. Whatever happened to anguish in the house of God? Whatever happened to anguish in the ministry? It's a word you don't hear in this pampered age. You don't hear it. Anguish means extreme pain and distress. The emotion so stirred that it becomes painful. Acute, deeply felt inner pain because of conditions about you, in you or around you. Anguish, deep pain, deep sorrow, agony of God's heart. We've held on to our religious rhetoric and our revival talk, but we've become so passive. All true passion is born out of anguish. All true passion for Christ comes out of a baptism of anguish. You search the scripture and you'll find that when God determined to recover a ruined situation, He would share His own anguish for what God saw happening to his church and to his people. And he would find a praying man, and he would take that man and literally baptize him in anguish. You find it in the book of Nehemiah. Jerusalem is in ruins. How is God going to deal with this? How is God going to restore the ruin? Now, folks, look at me. Nehemiah was not a preacher. He was a career man. This was a praying man. And God found a man who would not just have a flash of emotion, not just some great sudden burst of concern and then let it die. He said, no, I broke down. Don't labor in prayer anymore. You won't weep before God anymore. You can sit and watch television and your family go to hell. Let me ask you, is what I just said convicted you at all? There's a great difference between anguish and concern. Concern is something that begins to interest you. You take an interest in a project or a cause or a concern or a need. I'm going to tell you something I've learned over all my years, 50 years of preaching. If it is not born in anguish, if it has not been born by the Holy Spirit, where when you saw and heard of the ruin that drove you to your knees, and all our projects, all our ministries, everything we do, where are the Sunday school teachers that weep over kids they know are not hearing and they're going to hell? You see, a true prayer life begins at the place of anguish, a place where lifetime decisions are made.
In a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. And there is very grave danger. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. But I am asking your help of informing and alerting the American people.
And I look at the whole religious scene today, and all I see are the inventions and ministries of man and flesh. It's mostly powerless. It has no impact on the world. And I wept, and I mourned, and I fasted. And then I began to pray night and day. Why didn't these other men, why didn't they have an answer? Why didn't God use them in restoration? Why didn't they have a word? Because there was no sign of anguish, no weeping, not a word of prayer. It's all ruin. Does it matter to you today? Does it matter to you at all that God's spiritual Jerusalem, the church, is now married to the world? That there's such a coldness sweeping the land? Closer than that, does it matter about the Jerusalem that's in our own hearts? The sign of ruin that's slowly draining spiritual power and passion, blind to lukewarmness, blind to the mixture that's creeping in. That's all the devil wants to do, is get the fight out of you and kill it, so you won't